Imagine a brand new flag rising, drums rolling, children cheering, while in windowless rooms half a world away, strangers quietly choose your leaders, bankroll your rivals, and script tomorrow's headlines. This isn't conspiracy theater. It's the hidden playbook behind Africa's first mornings of freedom, from Lumumba's Congo to Nkrumah's Ghana, where rumors beat armies and culture became a battlefield. Today, the tools have changed: algorithms, contracts, bases, but the logic hasn't. If you're ready to see how independence was steered from the shadows and how memory can take it back, you're in the right place. Welcome to My Blackness 100. Before we dive in, tap like to push this story to more people, share it with someone who cares about African sovereignty, and comment below. Which matters more now, control of resources or control of the narrative? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive. Let's begin. This is the world Susan Williams writes about in White Malice, a careful excavation of how, in the first decades after colonial rule, covert power tried to steer African independence back into a safer lane. Not through open conquest, but through a mixture of influence, fear, money, and stories. The story is not tidy. It will not fit into a slogan. But if you want to understand why the early promise of independence so often met a wall, you have to walk into these shadows. After the Second World War, maps were redrawn, and a new rivalry took shape. The United States and the Soviet Union pushed and pulled across continents, and Africa, vast, young, and rich in materials that fueled modern life, became central to that contest. Uranium for bombs, copper and cobalt for wires and batteries, oil for engines and ships, diamonds for industry and for the vanity of the powerful. Washington looked at the map and saw a risk. If too many African governments chose a socialist path, the economic and strategic balance could tilt fast. And so a choice was made. Rather than build patiently with new nations in public, covert tools would be used to guide their politics in private. How does that work in practice? It begins where people are hopeful and disorganized, because hope without structure is easy to shape. Covert officers seek out the ambitious, the aggrieved, the eloquent, the angry. They offer support that looks like friendship, a scholarship here, a printing press there, a little cash for a new office, a whisper to a reporter about who is unreliable and who is brave. They help form groups with comforting names: civic this, cultural that, development the other, then steer their statements toward convenient conclusions. They place stories in newspapers, they feed rumors to radio hosts, they fuel factional fights, and then pose as the only adults in the room who can calm the chaos. If you are in the crowd on Independence Day, you will not see any of this. You will only feel the ground shifting beneath your feet, and you won't know why. In December 1958, Accra, Ghana became the capital of a new mood. A year after independence, Kwame Nkrumah welcomed the All-African People's Conference. It was not a summit of governments. It was a gathering of freedom movements, delegates from colonies and protectorates, activists with scars and notebooks, organizers who had spent years hiding mimeograph machines and moving between safe houses. Patrice Lumumba arrived from the Congo. Tom Mboya came from Kenya. Frantz Fanon represented the Algerian struggle with the force of a man who had watched torture turn human beings into instruments. The air in Accra felt charged with purpose. People spoke about a continent that would not simply inherit European borders, but would rediscover itself, create its own languages of policy, and share resources across lines that had been drawn with ruler and ink. This vision was simple to say and hard to live. It demanded unity across different histories. It threatened foreign business models that treated Africa as a mine with a fence. It insisted that the word independence must mean control over land, ideas, money, and memory. For Western intelligence services, this conference was not just a meeting, it was a signal flare. The continent was speaking to itself without permission, and that could not be ignored. 2 years later, the Congo declared independence, and Patrice Lumumba became prime minister. He spoke in a way that made ordinary people feel tall. He wanted to end the colonial habit of exporting wealth and importing humiliation. He wanted the army to serve the nation rather than private interests. He wanted to ensure that the resources of the Congo, soaked in rubber, copper, diamonds, and uranium, would build Congolese schools and railways, rather than enrich firms headquartered oceans away. Within weeks, he was marked as a problem. In Washington and allied capitals, memos moved with unusual speed. The logic was blunt. If he stayed, he would not stay quiet. If he refused to be managed, others would move to manage him. What followed was a storm. Provincial leaders declared their own fiefdoms with the encouragement of foreign advisors. Propaganda painted Lumumba as reckless, unstable, or captured by communist handlers. Letters appeared that he had not written. News stories quoted sources that did not exist. Foreign money flowed toward military figures who promised order and delivered control. Lumumba was chased, betrayed, arrested, and transferred between hands that squeezed tighter with each passing day. In the end, he was murdered. The details remain contested, but the shape of the tragedy is clear enough. A young democracy was taught a brutal lesson about how far it could go before it threatened the comfort of others. If the Congo was a warning shot, Ghana was a long campaign. From the moment Ghana broke free in 1957, Nkrumah stood out as a leader with an audacious program. He spoke openly about a continent-wide project and tried to build institutions that could support it: research centers, training schools, state corporations, and a foreign policy that refused to sit neatly in one camp. He made mistakes, as leaders do under pressure. He centralized power and signed off on laws that could be used against his opponents. But he also built, dreamed, and called on Africans to imagine more than survival. For that, he was watched. Opposition groups found friends who understood printing budgets. Student politicians discovered that money for buses to rallies could appear on time. Soldiers who disliked Nkrumah's direction began to meet more often, always with plausible reasons. In February 1966, while Nkrumah was out of the country, a coup replaced him, with uniforms that made foreign investors breathe easier. Western capitals cheered in private. The red carpet rolled out for the new men. Ghana returned to what they called the Western camp. At home, the dream of continental unity staggered but did not die.
The struggle did not end with guns and bulletins. There was another front, quieter, dressed in tweed and soft power. Williams describes a network of cultural initiatives that carried money and influence into universities, magazines, conferences, and arts festivals. Some of these were routed through philanthropic foundations with pristine reputations. Others were channeled through organizations dedicated to the freedom of ideas, which is the kind of phrase that closes criticism before it can begin. What did this cultural front do? It selected which writers to publish, which scholars to fund, which conferences to headline, which journals to quote. It favored essays that recommended gradual reform under friendly guidance and treated radical self-determination as naive, dangerous, or impolite. In time, entire syllabi bent towards certain conclusions. Students learned frameworks that began with foreign assumptions and always seemed to end there too. If you could not win every election, you could still win the curriculum. This is not to claim that every artist or professor who received funding was a puppet. People wanted to work, to travel, to think, to print their books. But influence is rarely a single heavy hand. It is 1,000 small invitations that slowly redirect the river. You do not need to censor a critic if you can starve his magazine. You do not need to jail a poet if you can ensure that her grant application always comes back marked, regrettably, not this year. The results across the continent were uneven but recognizable. Where leaders aligned with foreign expectations, contracts flowed. Where leaders demanded to rename the terms, crises arrived. Newspapers often chose the language of stability, which is a soft word that can hide a hard reality. Silence is easy to govern. Young democracies learn to perform a narrow dance. Enough independence to be respectable, enough obedience to be reliable. The public grew cynical. Voters watched promises dissolve into sudden coups that were explained as necessary for order. The phrase national interest became a cloth you could drape over almost anything. Decades later, the forms have changed, but the logic resists retirement. Today, surveillance is cheaper and quieter. Disinformation can flood a city in hours, shaped by algorithms that understand your anger better than your friends do. Contracts for minerals and infrastructure arrive inside briefcases stamped with new flags, but old ambitions. Military bases sit behind high fences next to villages that never asked for them. Civil society is now a crowded field where sincere activists work shoulder to shoulder with organizations that answer to distant donors. Elections come and go with smiling monitors, while the real deals are signed by men who do not stand for office. So what do we do with this history? We do not repeat it as a hymn to bitterness. We do not pluck out the parts that flatter our side and throw away the parts that cut. We read it the way a medic studies a wound, to understand how deep it went, how it got infected, and how it might heal. Memory is not an ornament, it is a tool. When you see how a rumor was built, you become slower to share the next one. When you learn how a university department was tilted, you ask better questions about who funds the seminar. When you grasp why a leader was first celebrated and then destroyed, you stop believing that every reversal was an accident. Remember the names that anchor this story: Lumumba, Nkrumah, Sankara, Cabral. And remember the unnamed too, the organizers who hid at midnight meetings, the journalists who refused a bribe they needed, the mothers who memorized dates and kept them alive at the kitchen table. Remember, because forgetting is profitable. Forgetting lets the same tricks work again with slightly different logos. Forgetting tells young people that nothing ever changes, which is the smoothest lie power can sell. But remembrance alone is not a plan. Independence, as one leader once put it, in essence, is not the end of the road. It is a daily practice. It looks like insisting on transparent contracts and insisting that those contracts are actually read in public. It looks like building statistical agencies that cannot be bullied and newspapers that do not live and die by one donor. It looks like teaching students to follow money trails and to recognize the difference between disagreement and disloyalty. It looks like strengthening courts until no one, friend or foe, can buy a verdict. It looks like refusing to beg for respect and choosing to build it instead. None of this is easy. It asks citizens to be patient with boring work and impatient with soft corruption. It asks leaders to accept scrutiny even when it is unkind. It asks foreign partners to stop confusing access with friendship. But the alternative is worse, a future in which flags change and anthems change, but the terms of the deal never do. White Malice is not a comfortable read. It is not meant to be. It tells a story in which many actors believed they were saving the world while breaking other people's futures. It shows that empire can survive without a governor's house if it can live inside your institutions and your language. It shows that power loves a vacuum and that the space after independence, confusing, hopeful, raw, is easy to fill with old habits wearing new suits. If you are watching this from a city where the power goes out at dinner, or from a village where the road has been promised for 10 years, or from a campus where your lecturer assigns books that describe your country as a case study rather than a home, here is what I would ask you to hold on to. The people who shaped the early years of independence were not superhuman. They were brave and sometimes wrong. They made choices under pressure and sometimes chose badly. The people who undermined them were not caricatures either. They were skilled and patient. They understood that a rumor can be stronger than an army if you choose the right moment. To meet that kind of opponent, you need a different kind of strength. The strength to be boringly honest, to be relentless with facts, to care more about institutions than about saviors, to keep going when the applause dies. In the end, the fight over Africa's future has always had two fronts. One is visible: votes, rallies, contracts, uniforms. The other is invisible: classroom reading lists, editorial calendars, private assurances, the stories nations tell themselves about what is possible. The second front shapes the first. If your story says you will always lose, you probably will. If your story says you are still a child in need of guardians, someone will show up with a smile and a form for you to sign. So, let us tell a different story, one that does not hide from the hard pages, but also does not accept that the hard pages must be the last ones. Let us teach the skills that make manipulation expensive and truth cheaper to find. Let us read widely, argue fairly, and refuse to outsource our memory. Let us be suspicious of any plan that requires silence to succeed. Let us insist that the people most affected by decisions sit at the table before the pens come out. Those rooms with no windows will always exist. There will always be meetings you are not invited to and memos you will never read. But the square on the first morning of independence still belongs to you. The flag still climbs the pole. The music is still a little out of tune. The children are still waving paper colors they made at the kitchen table. The work is to make that morning more than ceremony. Not a day of sudden freedom followed by years of careful control, but a daily, imperfect, determined practice of deciding together. That is the promise the early leaders reached for, and the promise so many try to steal. It is the promise you inherit. And if you keep your memory sharp and your eyes open, it is a promise you can still make real. Thanks for watching. If this helped you see the story behind the headlines, tap like, share it with someone who cares, and drop a comment on what we should uncover next. Subscribe to My Blackness 100 and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new drop. And don't stop here. Explore more powerful videos on Black empowerment and excellence right on My Blackness 100. Your view, your voice, your memory. That's how we build.